Thank you very much, the organizers, for inviting me to Eric's memorial. I'm honored to contribute to this celebration. Although I had only a few personal contacts with Eric, we met several times through the years, and I followed his works and initiatives always with much interest. So my memory of him is that of an extremely kind and peaceful person and a passionate scientist. My tribute to Eric here is to present a synthesis work largely based on open access databases, and this is a path that Eric has extensively explored. I will present three population dynamics from a perspective opposite to what is normally done, not as rates of spread of plant populations as a measure of their ability to survive global change, but as plant range loss as a measure of plant vulnerability. I carried out this work with James Worth from Japan and other colleagues. To achieve this goal, we compare data from different global data sets on a geographical basis. We assembled a worldwide compilation of the last occurrences of plant taxa across all continents over the last 30,000 years based on pollen and macrofossil records. Then we used the distance of the last occurrences of plant to the nearest corresponding modern population as an estimate of the range loss that has not since been recovered. And to do that, we largely used online databases of modern plant distribution, for example, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And finally, we compared the records of past range losses for conifers with the distribution of modern endangered conifers to evaluate whether a correspondence may be found. And we use the database, the open database of the UCN Red List of threatened species. Just a few words on the methodology we used. We searched the last occurrences of plant taxa in pollen, macrofossil, and stomata records by examining the online Neotoma paleoecology database and the associated databases. And we refined these results by systematically searching the published scientific literature in a range of different languages. To reduce false positive, we restricted the records of the last occurrences to those more than 25 kilometers from the nearest modern population for macrofossils and stomata, and for at least 100 kilometers for pollen records. So of course, this is a hot question, which is pretty much the same as detecting the first occurrences of an expanding population in the postglacial, or identifying glacial refugia based on pollen. So we might discuss for years about this. To overcome chronological uncertainties, last occurrences were grouped in time intervals of 1,000 years, and only radiocarbon dated records were used. Shortly, the results, we found almost 200 records of last occurrences, including 56 genera across 6 continents. A total of 105 of these records were based on macrofossils, 88 on pollen, 4 on stomata records, and there was also one from ancient DNA. The majority of range losses were of gymnosperms, with 126 records in 5 families, mostly conifers, of the Cupressaceae, Pinaceae, and Podocarpaceae families. Here in this plot, the distance of the last occurrence in the vertical scale from modern population is plotted against the time 30,000 years in the horizontal scale. So our data show that no relation exists between the age and the distance of the last occurrences from modern populations, as a range of different distances is found at any time of the analyzed period of 30,000 years. So our data indicate that range losses are not time dependent. So here the number of last occurrences is plotted against distance from the living stands. The mean distance of last occurrences from the nearest living stand population is almost 500 kilometers, with 44% representing range losses of over 300 kilometers and 13% over 800 kilometers. Both pollen in blue and macrofossil records in green were similar in terms of distance to the nearest living stand. The number of records of last occurrences here are grouped in classes of 100 kilometers from the extant populations decrease with the distance from the living stand, and they decrease following a negative power law. So they appear to be space dependent. Here, the last occurrences are plotted against time in 1,000 years intervals and are compared with the North Grip oxygen isotope record. So we see that the peaks of last occurrences are found in the late glacial and in the early Holocene, in the time interval 16 to 14 and 12 to 10,000 years pp. Which are two time periods characterized by abrupt climate changes. So these high numbers might be due to shifts of plant populations leaving their territories they occupied in the last glacial maximum. During the last glacial maximum, to the right of the diagram, there is a relatively low number of range losses, which might be related also to a low number of available records. However, relatively low values are observed also during the middle and late Holocene, where the number of available records is extremely high. In the Holocene, plant range losses were more or less constant in frequency, paralleling the more or less stable record of climate change. Unexpectedly, we do not observe any increase in the number of losses during the last thousands of years, despite the increased human activity. And this is really unexpected. So I would say that in general, it appears that range losses are climate dependent. As I already said, a stark finding was the higher number of gymnosperms compared to angiosperms. And this is consistent with a higher proportion of conifers currently facing extinction. According to the UCN red list, 34% of conifers are endangered in some way. So now I will limit the analysis to conifers. And this is the geographical distribution of the last occurrences of conifers we found. The green dots represent the loss of conifers. The size of the dots corresponds to the distance from extant populations. The greater the dot, the larger the distance. The red areas represent the number of modern endangered and vulnerable conifers per administrative region based on the UCN red list database. So the comparison of past lost ranges, the green dots, and modern threatened conifers, the red areas, show that in general areas with populations that disappeared in the past often include endangered species at present as well. Thus, in a sense, the fossil data would anticipate the modern threats of biodiversity loss. However, in some cases, conifer populations in the past were lost in areas where there is no conservation concern at present. This is the case, for example, for some equatorial podocarps in South America and in Africa, which are located up to 1,000 kilometers distance from the modern ones. And this may indicate that in these regions, vulnerable conifer populations have already disappeared, and therefore they are not vulnerable anymore. In the early Holocene, several conifer taxa disappeared along a stretch of thousands of kilometers at the tundra-taiga interface in Eurasia and North America as a result of declining summer insolation. In this case, these range losses were within distances of less than 300 kilometers from modern ranges, so they have a good potential of recovery, and in fact, they do not correspond to an area currently threatened by vulnerability. Also in the Western United States, several lost populations are recorded at a modest distance from the modern ones, suggesting potential for recovery via dispersal. In Australia, the situation is different. Three conifer genera disappeared from the continent, Dacricarpus, Dacridium, and Phyllocladus, and did not recover. So the question arises whether these taxa will ever be able to reoccupy their lost territories, having disappeared from the whole continent. And finally, a large number of last occurrences is found in the southern latitudes of Eurasia, where we know that many conifer species underwent extinction or disappearance during the Pleistocene, including genera like Tsuga, Cataya, Taxodium, Glyptostrobus, Sidrus, Larix, Chadopitis, and others. So this suggests that these losses might be also included in long-term processes of plant extinctions. So a final comment: our database of past plant losses may be the first step of a new strategy for the assessment of biodiversity loss, based on the joint use of spatio-temporal information of plant vulnerability from both fossil and modern databases. Relating modern threatened species to past lost ranges of populations is indispensable to trace back the current vulnerability of threatened species and to evaluate the rate of range loss through time, and also to plan short and long-term conservation actions and priority settings. So it seems to me that this may be a follow-up of the great work developed by Eric and of his legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donatella. This is